Hello, my name is August Harley Wickman, they, them, and I'm a graduate student in the Masters of Applied Sociology program, as well as an adjunct professor for the Intro to Transgender Studies class, and I will be moderating this panel on anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. Today, our speakers are Barbara Risman, Jessica Fish, Stef Shuster, and Kate Drabinski. So if you'd like to come on up, I think that's what happens now. Okay, wonderful. Barbara Risman, Risman, come on up.
Whoops, I have to get to my presentation. Get out of here.
It should be panel 2, speaker 1.
Here we go. Okay. Worked. Okay. First, I just want to say that some of the background information from this is done by a really fabulous undergraduate research assistant, Gina May, and I just want to give her credit for that. I'm starting, so I'm going to give a big overview of where we are right now. Probably in 40 years of my career, I've never started with a personal anecdote before, because that's not my style, but I can't start this without one. Because I didn't come here today from home. I came here today from my hometown where I grew up, in Lynn, Massachusetts. And I was in Lynn, Massachusetts unexpectedly for the funeral of a very close cousin's daughter, a transgender woman who committed suicide. I wrote this presentation long before this happened. That was just on Monday. So to do this presentation without honoring her and reminding all of us that this isn't just some intellectual, good leftist, woke research we're doing, but it has incredible impact on people's lives and on destruction, breaking families apart with grief. And so I, first and probably the only time I'll ever start a presentation with a personal thing. I want to take you back. I want to do a little historical moment, which is this started, the first bill I can remember was HB 2 in 2015 in North Carolina. It was a bathroom bill. It was a big crisis in American politics, if those of you who remember it. I was president of Southern Sociological Society then. We did a lot of conversations of what states could we ever go to North Carolina again, because we weren't going to go to a state that had a bill that didn't allow people freedom, to use the facilities wherever they needed to. And it instigated all sorts of boycotts. The National Collegiate Athletic Association wouldn't go to North Carolina. The NBA moved its all-star game from North Carolina. Corporations, including the Deutsche Bank and a German bank and PayPal, they didn't leave North Carolina, but they stopped expansions and said, we're not going to build or ask our employees to move to North Carolina. The diversity of artists that refused to go to North Carolina, from DeFranco to Starr to Isaac Perlman to Bruce Springsteen. This was a cultural moment, right? And I think that what happened is that we had a cultural whiplash. April 28, 2015 was Obergefell versus Hodges, which was a Supreme Court decision, of course, legalizing marriage between people of the same sexes or genders. And then very soon after that, we had the North Carolina bathroom bill as a really cultural whiplash. And it wasn't a moment in what we saw, of course, was, and as the Southern Sociological Society saw, is that we couldn't very well never go to North Carolina again. We couldn't meet in any state in our whole region again, if that were the case, because what we saw was that wasn't one moment, but it was the beginning of a series of legislation that sought to move us back to a place that was much less welcoming than we had been moving. And so this is really the only data I'm going to show you. And I want to show you that there are 29 states right now that actually have anti-discrimination laws that are, okay, good, I'm almost done. Laws that are, pro-human rights. And then look at the other laws. 21 have legislation against Category X. 27 bans on trans youth in sports. 13 others have bathroom bills, just like that North Carolina one. 12 have laws about language, pronouns. Can you imagine what's going on in legislators' mind to have a law against using whatever pronoun you want? And then, of course, 25 have bans against. Am I on the internet here? I am. Okay, can I make this have sound? I wanted you to see that in line. Kamala Harris, I'm for you. Kamala Harris is for they, them. So this is smack in the middle. It's the closing 3 weeks of this election campaign. It's about this. So it's a scary time to live. Go vote.
Thank you so much. I'd like to introduce our next speaker, which is Jessica Fish, presenting Policy and LGBTQ Youth Health Perspectives for Progress.
Okay. Good morning. I'm going to talk very closely to the microphone because I have laryngitis. So bear with me. Usually volume is not an issue of mine, but it is today, so apologies. Thank you to the organizers for having me here today and for having us collectively talk about the current perils of playing politics with people's lives, frankly. Although many LGBTQ adolescents are healthy and thriving, let me get my notes here. Over 2 decades of research show that LGBTQ youth have disproportionately high rates of mental health, substance use, and sexual health risk when compared to their heterosexual and cisgender peers. And these health inequities are conceptualized through minority stress theory, which explains how stigma jeopardizes the health and well-being and thriving of sexual and gender minority populations. These include interpersonal experiences, such as harassment and discrimination, but also more structural factors, such as policies and social attitudes that inhibit opportunities and protections under law. Although most research examines the impact of stigma on LGBTQ youth health at the interpersonal level, research on structural stigma has grown exponentially in recent years to identify how social conditions, norms, and policies limit opportunities for health and well-being for sexual and gender minority populations. Policy is a unique aspect of structural stigma, and arguably one of the most malleable relative to social conditions and norms. And the need for scientific and public understanding of the association between policy and LGBT youth health is well justified in the current moment, where contemporary sexual and gender minority youth are coming of age during heightened political discourse and volatility, and I'll say also, per the last presenter, weaponization. Many of you are likely aware of the current rise, thank you, Dr. Risman, of an LGBTQ and anti-trans legislation, the policies of which restrict or altogether ban LGBTQ inclusive curriculum and resources, books, bathroom access, sports participation, restrict and criminalize access to life-saving gender-affirming care, and encourage forced outing from school officials, just to name a few. These proposed and enacted policies around the United States run counter to what we know scientifically is necessary to support LGBTQ youth thriving, and will only exacerbate the health inequities for LGBTQ young people, particularly for transgender youth. So given the increased attention to LGBTQ youth relevant policy and the proliferation of studies examining the link between policy and health for sexual and gender minority populations, my colleagues and I thought it was particularly an opportune time to conduct a scoping review on LGBTQ youth health. In particular, we conducted our scoping review to document and help advance opportunities for future research in this area. Our study, which was limited to studies that tested the relationship between a single policy or sets of policies and mental health, substance use, or sexual health outcomes among sexual and gender minority youth under the age of 26 in the United States, we yielded 21 studies, all published after 2014. With the growth in research assessing structural stigma, we were actually quite surprised at how few empirical studies have actually explicitly tested this association, particularly among transgender youth. Of the 21 studies, 48 assessed policy associations with mental health, 38% with substance use, 24 with sexual health, with the overwhelming majority noting significant associations between policy and health outcomes. Regarding policy measurement, 62% focused on sexual and gender minority specific policies, whereas 38% focused on non-sexual and gender minority policies. 62% assessed associations with a single policy, a quarter used a score of 2 or more policies, and almost all studied policies at the state level. 1 was national. Studies were overwhelmingly cross-sectional. 62% used probability samples. Half tested differences between heterosexual and cisgender LGB youth, where a quarter were limited to sexual and/or combinations of sexual and gender minority youth. Only one, focused exclusively on policy impacts for transgender youth, even though they are by far and large the target of most of these policies. So to recap some major takeaways, findings emphasize the importance and need to expand sexual orientation and gender identity data collection in probability samples. The YRBS was overwhelmingly used, and it really is one of the only that really focuses on young people at the probability sampling strategy. And how opt-out policies, even with the YRBS, bias samples towards more favorable states. Those that don't want to ask it typically are more hostile. Current data sources also limit opportunities for research and policy impacts for transgender youth, albeit there are opportunities to do this, and so we should really be seeing more work in this area. Thank you. Regarding policy measurement, we argue that there needs to be more measurement sensitivity work, and how our measures and methodology choices impact our findings and associated recommendations. For example, when using a policy score or indice, it is not clear which policy or indice has the most impact on influencing LGBT youth health, or the mechanisms that those health outcomes are derived from. We also noted the lack of studies that examined the impact of enacting policies that restrict the rights of LGBTQ folks. All of these studies, with the exception of one, were about the enactment of protections, and we are in a different world right now. And so we really need to see a lot more. Although we bear witness to this every day, but unfortunately we sometimes have to scientifically, empirically support what we see in the day-to-day lives of people. So we need more work in this area. We also recommend that there'd be benefits to study the differential implementation of policy. Passing a policy of one thing, the way you implement and enforce that policy is a totally different animal. And we need to understand how enforcements trickle down into the everyday lives of young people to influence their health and well-being at a very critical time in their lives. And lastly, there needs to be more work investigating who and under what conditions these policies might be most effective. It is not a one-size-fits-all model, and whether these policies might differentially benefit those with privileged identities and social circumstances that benefit most from these policies. And we need a lot more work to better understand that, to improve their impact for young people. So some quick conclusions. I know I'm out of time. Policy is uniquely powerful level for influencing LGBTQ youth health. Ooh. And there are plenty of opportunities to advance research and public understanding for the need for policy enactment and implementation. I would argue that the current political climate also needs us to consider how this impacts families, because this is a family experience for many young people and the people who care for them, and we need a lot more work to see how this influences the family system. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica Fish. Next, Steph Schuster will be presenting How Regret is Weaponized to Socially Control Trans People.
Is there a way to make a little more? Is that okay to move this just for now? I don't want to like mess anything up. Move this. Okay. Cool. Thank you. All right. Good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here. This is my first time really kind of passing through a space like the CCF. So today I just want to talk for a little bit about how regret is weaponized to socially control trans people. And I'll note that this is a part of my newer project on trans reproduction, which is supported by an NSF career grant. So over the last decade, trans people have experienced renewed attention on our request to access medical care. I'm particularly taken with how legislators are using certain ideas to advance their efforts to ban access to trans care. So I see threads in the discourse that trace back to the professionalization of trans medicine in the mid-20th century. I'm going to very briefly take us back to the 1950s when ideas about regret became mobilized and then weaponized by the medical community. So medical providers were keen to ensure that people seeking gender-affirming interventions would not come to regret their decisions. And this was a difficult task to accomplish, as providers also tended to assume that, as one provider wrote to a colleague in 1963, quote, "they lie without conscience." In response to the mistrust, trans people often felt compelled to prove their reliability to providers. So as one trans person wrote to the Johns Hopkins Gender Identity Clinic in 1972, quote, "I want you to understand that my need to have this operation is not in passing, but is something of the deepest importance to me and has been for a long time." So as this person highlights, trans people knew that they had to convince providers that they were not making a decision in haste and would not come to regret their decision. To ensure that trans people wouldn't change their minds, providers created really restrictive practices. So for example, in the mid-20th century, trans people were asked to pass what was at the time called the real life test, where they were expected to live their lives as if they had already transitioned, but without the aid of medical interventions. And upon successful completion of this test, which was for a lengthy amount of time, at one point it was for 2 years, providers would then consider the request to begin interventions. So some of the patterns from my research from my first book, Trans Medicine, and a lot of those quotes were coming out of the Kinsey Institute archives. It informs what we're seeing playing out in legislative chambers across the country. Today, misconceptions of regret are weaponized by legislators to discredit and also infantilize trans people. At a recent congressional hearing on trans medicine, Representative Wesley Hunt, a Republican from Texas, opined, sorry, and some of these quotes are kind of silly, so it's hard to do it with a straight face, but I'll do my best. "I want you to imagine something. What would happen if we affirmed every thought that our children have? If my children have their way, they would have ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and for every single meal in between. Oh, the wisdom of children. But in the same country, we know that children are not adult enough to make adult decisions that will impact the rest of their lives." So Representative Hunt makes clear that from his perspective, youth are too young to know their gender, and just like having ice cream for every meal, will come to see the error of their ways if allowed to make these kinds of decisions. I'm going to hop ahead just a little bit. I do want to note before I start working towards broader implications that while a lot of the legislation that has been passed or is being pushed through emphasizes the precarity of youth, there are recent attempts by legislators to begin focusing on trans adults as well. So in my current home state of Michigan, Republican State Representative Josh Shriver asked in a Twitter Spaces conversation, quote, "If we're going to stop this for anyone under 18, why not apply it for anyone over 18? It's harmful across the board, and that's something we need to take into consideration in terms of the end game. Let me wrap up that the idea of regret, tethered to social conceptions of who can make decisions over their bodies, their reproductive futures, and upholding normative ideas of adulthood that were mobilized by the medical community, have begun to spill over into other institutions. And some of the broader implications include, for medical providers, using gatekeeping as a tool to benevolently help their clients avoid regret by slowing down access to gender-affirming care. However, emphasizing the anticipatory regret of transitioning also discredits patients' agency to make their own health decisions. How legislators employ regret is aligned with older tropes of the paternalistic state in protecting people from themselves. Troublingly, it enables an overreach of legislative power into healthcare, the expansion of religious ideals into the private homes of people, upending parental authority, and also disbanding notions of informed consent. How legislators are weaponizing regret, which I passed over in most of my remarks here, cast doubt on trans people's self-determination over our own bodies, health access, and well-being by offering a mechanism for the social control of trans people. So, thank you.
And our final presenter for this panel is Kate Drabinski, one of my beloved mentors, and she will be presenting LGBTQ+ intergenerational dialogues and storytelling as justice practices.
Thank you, August. Last week I had ice cream and popcorn for dinner, and I had 0 regrets. It was awesome. Okay. This is me. Hold on, slideshow from beginning. Okay. So we're going to end on an up note for this panel, and I'm going to talk a bit about a public workshop, public project that I've started doing with students a few years ago, working with a retirement center called Charlestown Senior Living. It's not really a retirement center, it's a senior living community. It's like a campus. It's like living on campus for the rest of your life. But I started doing presentations there, and I started bringing students, August was one of them, so you'll see your picture in a second, to talk with the residents about our experiences and also give the residents a chance to talk to us about their experiences. And so I want to tell you about this project and what I think is really great about it. I am so grateful for Dr. Fish, like that. You're right, we need research, and then we also can go do things. So I can't wait. I just was excited by your presentation and the possibilities, so I wanted to say that. Okay, so I think storytelling is really important. I think that as we, and there's a bunch of scholarship about what makes storytelling important, but we all know that if I tell you a story with a name on it, it means it can actually change you. You can have feelings about that human being in a way that numbers don't really do that for you. So I have found storytelling to be a really important practice in my classrooms as students share with me their experiences, to connect with scholarship, to actually see how doing work in the humanities and social sciences changes lives, right? So that's why I use storytelling. So I was first asked to come to Charlestown because the community had put on a pride celebration, and some members of the community had gotten really upset because there was a pride flag hanging in the, when you drove onto the campus, you could see this pride flag. And some people were really anti-flags, but we know what that means, right? It's always anti-people. And so they were like, well, maybe somebody could come in and like teach about this stuff and it wouldn't be so scary. So I was brought in to do I've done now 9 of these sessions. The 10th you get free lunch at the campus restaurant. And so I did, the first one was just LGBTQ 101, and I went through terminology and answered questions, and the audience, and I think that young people in particular think that older people are like all really conservative and secretly hate them. And that's absolutely not true, right? There is as much diversity in every age group as there is with the youths. So other than a few, my favorite question was, you mentioned you have a wife. Does that mean you're a husband? Very dramatically. But mostly the questions were really like, can you help me talk to my grandkid about this? Like, what should I say? Or like, how do I be supportive? So really kind of great questions. Then I started bringing students. We've done it a couple times, and August is going to bring students in a few weeks for another one of these. And this has been really great. Like, it was apparently the talk of Charlestown once we left. We were superstars. And I think what I've found really, really useful about these sessions is that the residents can ask questions of the students that come with me that they don't feel comfortable asking their grandkids or other people in their families. And we've seen some really great change in different residents. So there's one woman who has been to every single one of my talks. She should get a punch card too. And I remember the set when I did I did a session that was just about transgender identities and non-binary identities. And this woman, her grandkid was named after her and then changed his name. And when she talked to me about this after the session, there were real tears. And so we talked about, it becomes a comfortable place to not only see that it's okay to have grief, right? Have all the feelings in the world, but then meet some students and be able to talk to them about why that name change is important to them, right? And I've seen her really move in her thinking in some really powerful ways. I also did a session, so I started doing these for lots of places, and I did one for a company that made a remote control that puts Zoom on the TV. Great idea. Anyway, and a person raised their hand at the end and they said, I'm 80, is it too late for me? And once they learned about non-binary identity as a thing, and it's like there's real power to this. And I think that it's really important to focus on youth, but to focus also on people at all stages of the life course. And there's probably a retirement center or a public library or something near you, and I highly recommend you share your research there. I also work on an oral history project. This is Donna. We hang out all the time. But this is another picture of students. It's been really impactful and powerful for me, my students, and the residents of Charlestown. And I'm 20 seconds over, sorry.
And now I'd like to invite our panelists up for roughly 10 minutes of questions.
Get my steps in. Even though it's been in class yesterday, the steps thing just made up number. Totally unrelated.
So thank you for your presentation. And one thing, I think it kind of, the question that I had for me, I think your presentation really brought it together, is I'm curious about, what's going on in terms of policy, how that trickles down, but also how we can think about that in terms of maybe what's happening from the bottom up. So especially with, well, that's not the bottom, but media, but also just generational differences and thoughts or changing acceptance of diverse gender identities and sexualities, and how do those two kind of meet in the middle to influence youth? Because I feel like maybe two polar things are happening in a sense, and I was just wondering of your thoughts on that.
I can speak a little bit to that. Well, let's be clear that I think your playing of the attack ad on Kamala Harris is a really good example of how this has been thrust into the social political consciousness on purpose to disenfranchise, scapegoat, and harm a group of people for political gain, particularly young people, right? And there's a lot of power in that. And so while you're talking about a top-down and a bottom-up, you have to recognize that the top-down is creating horrific conditions for young people and their families. And I think a lot of people who can have moved, and a lot of people can't and are stuck, and are feeling uniquely helpless to be able to support, I'm going to come at it from a young person's perspective, to help their child, to even to seek. I mean, gender-affirming care also includes gender-affirming mental health care, right? We're not talking about surgeries. We're talking about them being able to see a school counselor who can affirm them in that space. And so the top-down is quite powerful and influential. And there's a lot of pushback, but it comes at a price, right? There's young people who go around their state and are in front of their legislature every time there's an open session. And they are tired, and their parents are tired, and the public eye on them is also puts them in harm's way, vulnerabilizes them. And so I think there's a lot of pushback. Now that's not to say that they are helpless. They may feel helpless. There's a lot of power in that. And people have been able to organize, and there are bills that have not made it out of committee, and we've been able to do a lot of things in those regards. But it's an unequal pitting, right? To say that the state that is imposing these laws and policies and restrictions are preventing people from being able to seek life-saving care. It has real consequences, truly. And so I think the mobilization is really important. Voting is really important. Not being silent is really important. All these things are important, but it's also to be able to, in your local community, think about how do we develop resources, safe spaces, school resources. So you kind of have to find your in wherever you can to support young people in a way that the state will just absolutely not at the moment. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I would ask students once, because the attacks on LGBTQ people in policy it's been going on, right? It's amping up, and when it was that amping up, I asked students, what do you want to do about this? And they said that they wanted, my students, a small group, right? I'm not that kind of scientist, but they universally said, we want to go to college and do our homework and fall in love, get our hearts broken, and get a job that's not good or whatever. And they said we would like other people to do this. So that labor of the youth having to defend their right to exist over and over again, and that's another reason why I do this stuff at Charlestown is I'll do the educating, right? You don't have to be trans or queer to do this work, and that's been, I think, helpful. Take something off the trans kids' plates. I mean, they're just trying to get through the day and they just want to play video games or whatever every kid wants to do. Yeah.
It's just to try to be positive here, since I have a Pollyanna side of me. I love the idea of storytelling as it's a kind of subtle kind of political, to answer your question, ground up, rather than knocking on doors and talking about politics, but going into quasi-receptive spaces. I mean, there are retirement communities in red states too.
Oh, absolutely.
And storytelling, and as a kind of hitting the heart, as opposed to trying to. I think we know that we don't change people's minds too much with facts. Unfortunately, I would like that because I like facts. But the storytelling, the hitting people's hearts, may be, a way to think about political mobilization that we don't think about so much.
Well, one last thing, just to pitch for history. When I talk to students, though, I always start with when I teach transgender studies, start with history, because I think that some parents, some older people, think that gender non-normativity started with TikTok, and I'm watching. But gender non-normativity has always been with us, and identity categories have changed, and so that's what we learn in my classes, those theories. But it doesn't come from, it's not they, them, there's always been gender non-normativity, so normalizing that is important.
What you were talking about both with storytelling and politics made me think about North Carolina and how some people who are in power are now being outed for having, non-normative beliefs by other people who are, already discriminatory. And I guess I'm wondering how you make space for those people also. I'm thinking could be older people who could use the power of storytelling to not kind of change their rhetoric and say, yeah, I actually have done these things and I've been in that language and now I'm not. But I don't know how you reach those people.
I don't know what's going on in North Carolina, but you can tell us.
Okay. The guy who's running for governor in North Carolina was recently found to be on all these trans right. So it's like coming from the community that's spewing these messages, but how do you then, like, using storytelling, say like it's okay to change your mind and things like that. And those are the people who I feel like could be making a big impact also.
We're not going to change him.
I know.
I mean, you also have to understand that there are good
Just
faith
like a
actors and
big-
there are bad faith actors.
Right. It
Right,
just
like-
seems like a good opportunity.
Yeah.
That,
If people want to genuinely, in good faith, engage, they will. That's not a lot. There's a lot of people who don't, and it's quite frankly they don't care what the facts are, or who it harms. Perfectly okay.
Really?
I just, this is not about that, but I want to thank you, first of all. So, as the parent, especially as the parent of a trans non-binary teenager, who, this is the hopeful bit too, maybe a part of me is a Pollyanna, but my kid is confident and self-assured and knows who they are and says it out loud all the time and introduces themselves to people like, hi, I'm Sam, I'm non-binary and pansexual, nice to meet you. And I know I live in a blue city in a purple state. I live in Philadelphia, and my kid goes to a creative arts high school. So there are things that make it easier, but I also guess I want to say that like when Sam came out, their twin sister and all their friends were like, oh, cool. And like, I think the next generation is sort of teaching us something about like, there was no time lag of people getting used to new pronouns. There was no like, oh, but are you sure? None of it. They were like, great, we know who you are, that's wonderful. And so I know that's not universal. I know that doesn't happen everywhere. But the fact that it happens anywhere does give me some hope about how things are changing and things are moving forward. And that my 83-year-old parents also get my kids' pronouns right is really wonderful too, right? And so I feel like I see some changes.
I totally see some change. I've been teaching gender studies since 2003, and I went to a women's college in 1993, and there was one person who was out in my college class, right, at Barnard College, which, there were like 80% of us were out at the end. But now, like, my classrooms are filled with students who are out in high school. So those things change. The experiences that they tell me about when they're like from Crofton, Maryland, or the Eastern Shore, like rural places, they have very different experiences, right?
For sure.
And that's why I'm glad they're here, and then we can go to the city. But the internet has also been, I think, really powerful for making communities. So part of also policy change, but also the kind of mutual aid that queer youth and adults put together for themselves also gives me a lot of hope. I met with a student yesterday who was like, there are so many cool co-op communities starting in Baltimore. I can't wait to graduate and live in one. I'm like, yes. Thank you, Venus. Go get them.
I have actually the research I'm doing now. I have 120 interviews with non-binary folks in America and another 120 in 3 other countries. And the diversity of experiences, some are devastating, and you end the interview and you just want to cry, and others are like your child's sense of self, and the word feeling liberated, and I'm writing an article actually citing your Joy's piece, is like, we didn't ask about feeling liberated, and I cannot tell you how often in Spain and Australia and in the US, that kind of language is being used. So I think you're right.
And I can't say too, like, it is not all doom and gloom. Like, I start every talk. A lot of kids are thriving, are truly thriving. But there are conditions in which force on young people that thriving is not possible. Yes. And we need to be aware of how we can support them through our storytelling, through our outreach, through our advocacy, through our science.
And August definitely has an almost any, but we haven't heard from you.
Well, I've just been thinking over this conversation, and like I don't want to like go back into the darkness, but but I do think that there are particular sites that are important to really centralize as still struggling. So I too find it really inspiring that youth are like, yep, like I'm non-binary or I'm trans or I'm like, whatever. But like a lot of my work in healthcare and medicine consistently shows that health professionals have a really hard time leaning into the uncertainty and ambiguity. I mean, for all the youth who are like, I love gender ambiguity, like that creates a lot of uncertainty for providers because it's hard to take a particular way of thinking that is, step 1, 2, 3, and then expand the parameters, which is really asking for them to think in new ways about their ready-made tools for how they practice medicine. And I think in education we also see that. So.
All right. Thank you so much to our panelists. We are now going to take a 20-minute break. And for the record, if I was being too subtle about it, I am one of those thriving trans non-binary youth.